Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Nostalgia Trap podcast. My name is David Parsons. I am your guide through the conversations that we have on this program, and I've got another great one for you today. But before we get to that, I just want to mention that we have bonus episodes that are starting to go up and many more that are coming through the summer for subscribers only. So if you are a subscriber, go over to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. There's all sorts of stuff going up on the website, and that includes this week's first bonus episode, which is a conversation with Justin Rogers Cooper about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and blockchain technology and how all of that is going to intersect with the larger story of technology and capitalism that we are developing on our AM/FM episodes. So if you're into that stuff and you're into the kind of, I don't know, the long view take on some of the phenomena that we're seeing pop up, like Bitcoin today, that we do with Justin, then check out that bonus episode. I really enjoyed recording that one, and I hope more people get to listen to it. So if you want to listen to it, go subscribe to the show. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And for $5 a month, you get access to all the bonus episodes that we're putting out. And we'll be putting out a bunch over the course of the summer as we accelerate our podcasting. And, you know, that makes sense because I teach college. And so during the summer, I'm going to have much more time to podcast. I'm really looking forward to all the stuff we're going to put out for you. So if you want access to all that stuff, go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, and I appreciate it. Okay, so my guest today is Daniel McClure. I got turned on to Daniel McClure's work through David Fauser, who's another favorite guest on the Nostalgia Trap. Daniel McClure is currently teaching history over at Cal State Fullerton, and he got his PhD at the University of California, Irvine, which I think is where him and David Fauser first met. But either way, I really appreciated Dan's take on history, and in particular, you know, the whole idea of modernity. He's got this kind of long view of history that we like to do on this show. You know, he does that in his work, and you know, to put that more specifically, he talks about the big picture of modernity, and the way he defines modernity is, you know, the historical processes arising after the 1500s, including colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, the Atlantic slave system, the Enlightenment, and the nation state, and how all of those elements are still with us and how they've transformed. So he's got this thing where he likes to, you know, kind of zoom in to the moments within the 20th century American history, and then zoom out to that bigger picture and see how things fit together. And I really had a fun conversation with him, and I think that people who listen to the Nostalgia Trap, especially our AM/FM episodes, will really appreciate his perspective. So enjoy this episode and all the stuff that's associated with our podcast here and our little world we're building. I really appreciate all the support everyone gives us. So you can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Join up and start listening to our bonus episodes too. Okay, so enjoy this conversation. I really like this one. This is me talking with Professor Daniel McClure. So where are you originally from? I'm getting to know all these kind of Southern California historians now. Are you originally from Southern California?
No, I'm not really from anywhere, actually. I was born in Seattle, and then my dad was in construction. And so we basically moved every 2 to 5 years from, you know, Seattle to Wenatchee, Washington, to Bellevue, Washington, to back to Wenatchee, to, I think we lived in Idaho Falls for 2 years in Idaho.
Wow. So the Pacific Northwest seems like a well-traveled territory for you.
Yeah, I would usually just say I'm from the Pacific Northwest. Yeah. Then we moved to Portland, which we lived in Gresham, Oregon, which is like a suburb.
Yeah, and Gresham. There's a school there, isn't there? Gresham. I feel like that city's come up in my research somewhere. I don't know where. What's in Gresham?
Nothing. I mean,
yeah, I don't know why I've heard of it.
Mount Hood Community College.
There you go.
That's really the only. And then we moved to Visalia, California.
Oh yeah.
And that's where I went to high school. So that's, if I'm from California, it's because I guess I went to high school in Visalia, and then my parents moved back up to the Northwest. I stayed, ran out of money, moved back home. I went to a bunch of different community colleges,
And
somehow
during that time, I mean, I always like to hear, like, how did history and American history enter your life? Were you into that stuff when you were young, or is it something that came later?
No. History was easy in high school.
Yeah.
I wasn't great at math. I wasn't great at English, science. I was kind of like a mediocre 3.0. Like, I got a 3.0 so my parents wouldn't be pissed.
Right.
And then I think what clicked was probably at some point, my second community college was Lynn Benton Community College in right outside of Corvallis, Oregon. And so that's when I moved back up from Visalia. I couldn't take living at my parents, so then I moved in. I moved in with people I went to junior high with.
Wow.
And so that was a trip.
Yeah.
Literally, like, they were into some crazy stuff. So it literally was that.
Like, I'm thinking about I don't know, all the areas that you're talking about, including Visalia. I've been through a lot of those areas, and it's like I don't know, I would compare it to like the upstate New York in some way, and it's kind of like its socioeconomic landscape up there. It's there's a lot of, like, I don't know, like down and out white people and a lot of meth up there. I mean, was that? It seems like your experience was kind of like, I don't know, lots of white working class people and lots of poor people around. Is that right?
Yeah, basically. I mean, not like dirt. Like, it was.
I mean, it depends area to area, obviously.
There were some, but it's mostly that I was like the withering middle class.
Yeah, there you go.
Right, like a generation before, there'd only be one person with an income. Now, increasingly, there was two people with an income.
Mm-hmm.
And then I took a class at Lynn Benton, just a generic, U.S. history. And I did a paper on the Black Panthers. And that sort of that set me into like, oh, this is interesting. It opened a doorway to interpret stuff I saw but couldn't describe. I think I like to describe a lot of, especially to students, you should be immediately drawn to something for an unapparent reason. And really reading and going to class and discussing is about filling in the blanks of language and knowledge to be able to describe what you're seeing.
That's a great way of putting it. I like that.
And then I moved to Sacramento.
Nice.
Actually, no, I'm sorry. The place I lived with was getting really crazy. Not out of control, but and I was sort of dragged out to Kentucky. And I took a fall semester off, and I worked with my dad. He was setting up a lock and dam project in Kentucky. And so I went out and I worked as a laborer and a deckhand.
Wow. For
like 4 months. Did that, and then came back to Sacramento, and then that was my third community college at American River.
When you when you kept doing this, and you're kind of like going back to all these like different little like short stints at different community colleges, what's your path? I mean, what's in your mind? Are you thinking like this is leading to something? I'm gonna like eventually go to graduate school, or are you just kind of like directionless at this point?
Just complete directionless.
Yeah.
Like, I was interested in stuff. I was interested in music. Complete. There's no way I would have ever thought I would have got a PhD at that point. Just, it was sort of moving to the next town and see what's going on.
Right.
And so I went to Sacramento. There I took another history class. I can't remember the guy's name. I looked him up a while ago. He passed away. He was an older gentleman. He taught African-American history. So I took that. And then I kind of latched onto him to ask him, like, what should I do? Where should I go? And he recommended going to San Francisco State, because I kind of threw out, like, should I go to Sac State or San Francisco?
Right.
And he's like, you might have a more diverse experience at San Francisco State. And the only reason why I went to San Francisco State was because a friend was going there. Like, that's how directionless. Like, oh, you're going there? Oh, I'll go there too. Do they have history? And he's like, I think so. like, I guess I'll show up then.
Yeah, that idea of like kind of stumbling into academia without like really knowing what it was is a constant theme of this show, because I was the same way. I kind of like wound up at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City, but really had very little idea of like what it was and what the experience was going to be like. Was that part of it? Like, was part of that because like, did you not have? I mean, for me, it was because none of my family members had really been to graduate school. Like, I didn't really have that surrounding me. Are there any like academics or any of that in your family?
No, like I think my dad went to college for a year.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to be a doctor, and then the next thing you know, he's in Wyoming mining.
Wow.
Wow. Like, so he kind of was, I mean, his dad was a superintendent and his mom was a teacher.
Mm.
And I assume you have to have a college degree to get that.
Sure.
He didn't go I think he did a year, maybe 2 years of college, and then just was lured into, he was a carpenter basically. And then he worked his way up to superintendent, and then he became a project manager, that sort of thing. And then my mom didn't go to college. She like was kind of like did like secretary type work. She worked for the Air Force, and so I had no idea. There was no culture of going to grad school was exotic.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
Like what the hell is, like, and even at San Francisco State, one of the guys told me I couldn't make it. Like I was thinking of like, maybe I should do a master's program. And I asked one of the professors there, and he's like, I don't think you'd make it.
Wow.
And so I'm like,
I've heard lots of professors are that blunt, dude. Like, I heard that in not to me personally, but lots of people around me were told by professors like, you can't hack it, and you should just drop out of the program, which is intense to hear. Like, literally, like leaving the professor's office in tears, kind of shit.
Yeah, and it's. I think that should be there. I mean, always get a second opinion.
Yep.
Right, it's like a doctor's sort of thing.
Yeah, there's a brutality to it, though.
But yeah, I think that some people need to be told.
Yeah, no, that's.
And so and I went back and I worked in construction. Like construction.
So you believed it? Me. You were literally like, oh, okay, maybe I don't belong here.
It was more like, I'm going to put this on hold for a bit.
Okay.
And right around that same time, a project started up at the north side of the Golden Gate Bridge, and I get an email from my dad saying, hey, they need someone to like measure bolt, like basically $15 an hour, 1997, living in San Francisco. They need someone to be an engineer's helper. And it's just like, oh my God, who wouldn't do that?
Right.
We're living in the city. I mean, it was only, I think my rent was $400 a month.
Ugh.
And so it's like, yeah, of course I'll do this job. It's like, and I kind of used it as, well, I'm just going to read a bunch. I'll prove that professor wrong, right? Like, and so I kind of focused on just reading through stuff, getting, and a lot of it was music, but I tried to go down through like a really crude checklist of, Hobsbawm and that kind of stuff.
Your own kind of like, I don't know, background, theoretical education stuff. I mean, I don't know. Were you reading history stuff too? I feel like, you mentioned the Black Panthers, and I first, when I first got to graduate school, I started, researching that stuff, and like I was really into and still am, like the radicalism of the 60s and 70s, and like, but I felt like I had a lot to catch up on. Like I was like, I didn't really know the wider history of that era, and I noticed like, one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about when I saw your page on Cal State Fullerton, where it like talks about like the things you've written about. So many things come from that era. When did you start catching up with the 60s and 70s as an era of interest?
I mean, it was started with the Black Panthers, and then at San Francisco State, I did something on Abby Hoffman.
Mm-hmm.
I did something on Che Guevara. I did something on the Zapatista. I mean, that's not the 60s, but I was just, in the 60s, again, it's sort of my generation like that. I was born in 72.
Mm-hmm.
And so you just grow up with, my parents were older, so they didn't really count, but most of my friends' parents, they all listened to stuff from the 60s.
Yeah, yeah.
And then growing up in the 80s, the 60s are sort of, it's what the 40-year-olds are, still thinking about. So it's,
yeah.
And the people that I was learning from were all from the 60s. So, I was fascinated by that. Yeah, and so that kind of moved in that direction. And then I was, interested in music and whatnot. So I was always trying to find connections between music and politics and culture. And
what I mean, how do the politics enter into it? Like, why are you? I mean, I kind of talk about why I got into things like the Black Panthers and things like that. There's a lot of different kind of elements that like drew me to that stuff. But politically, where are you at this point? Like, why are you into these radicals of the '60s beyond the music? Like, what's the political element of it for you?
The political element would be so if as I was going through this, in a way, I guess you could think of it as those a three-dimensional map. So say, what was the second to the last Alien movie?
Oh God,
what was that one?
Was it Alien versus or Alien Resurrection? Was it or Alien versus Predator? I forgot.
No, it was the one where they find the ship and then the alien dude like irrationally starts attacking them.
The new
Prometheus.
alien. There you go, Prometheus.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I always think of it as remember that map. Like the best part of the movie was when they had the map.
That's right. Yep.
So it was a three-dimensional map of the universe or whatever. And so for me, 60s radicalism was a point within that map that then I started moving out away from. And so it's sort of for me like the gateway drug of looking at all this stuff. And then I started thinking about things in terms of systems. And so for me, it evolved into what does the 1960s look like from the perspective of the last 200 to 300 years.
Ooh.
Or last 500 years.
I like where you're going with that.
Right. So then I'm thinking like, well, we have to start filling in the blanks. And so I got interested in conservatism, capitalism, and eventually that moved into neoliberalism. So like the rise of neoliberalism, that's sort of the UNC book.
Yeah.
Looks at.
The neoliberalism, that word comes up a lot in your work. And it seems like when people talk about neoliberalism, they often kind of start their story in the 60s. It seems like that's like a place where at least one level of understanding of how we got to where we are today starts or begins to accelerate or begins to kind of coalesce this thing neoliberalism in the 60s. Am I right about that? Or I know you're like kind of like on the longer kind of timeline, but why what's the connection between the 60s and neoliberalism?
So it's a good word, that coalesce. So for me, at least, obviously neoliberalism begins somewhere in the 20s and 30s. You have Hayek writing against Keynesianism. So it's sort of a typical kind of reactionary conservative reaction to the rise of this welfare state amidst the Great Depression.
Right.
And that's where Milton Friedman comes in. And so in many ways, they're kind of marginalized figures in the 40s going into the 50s. But the moment that things start shifting is I would say, is really the rise of the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
And so the civil rights movement, while if it's focused in the South, then white people in the North don't really have anything to be scared of, right? Because it's just people in the South that want to go to a lunch counter and eat, or ride a bus without having to sit in the back. So there's really no threat. But eventually, white people start getting more uncomfortable, especially as we move from 63, 64, 65, and the civil rights movement starts looking at housing policies in the North.
Yeah, right.
And so then that becomes, for me, a huge moment. And so then that's where I would stop and say, well, why did this happen in that way? Because isn't it, everyone's supposed to be equal and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I have to zoom back out to the last 500 years, and the sort of the elements I put together for the last few years is put a modernity framework. So for me, modernity is the set of historical processes beginning in the 1400s, evolving through European expansion, and I throw in colonialism, settler colonialism, the Atlantic slave system, capitalism, the Enlightenment, the nation state, imperialism. And so these things evolve in a certain way that creates a language and knowledge that sets certain patterns in a direction. So we have a patriarchy that evolves in a certain way through forms of capitalism, the public-private sphere. We have the way that you sort of dehumanize people, right? There's a great book by Bruno Latour, I think it's called like We've Never Been Modern. And he comes up with this, his framework is modernity is basically, and it's Eurocentric, but I break it out into a more flexible model, but it's basically a binary of human and nature.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so human is essentially men of European descent, and nature is everyone else. But nature also has its own racial, sexual, gendered hierarchy.
Sure. Yeah.
And so that allows for, as a historian, because you have to theorize, but also not piss off historians who don't like theory. It allows you to kind of plug in elements within colonialism that are connected to capitalism, or the Atlantic slave system that's connected to capitalism, and map the way that different ideas about race and gender evolve over 500 years. And so for me, that's where the getting back to like the 60s, you have this component of anti-blackness.
Yeah.
Right. So anti-blackness comes out of slavery. It comes out of capitalism and property relations. It comes out of the dehumanization, the exclusion of civil society. That model, that ontological framework, literally is the DNA of Americans. So that's why there's Black Lives Matter, and that's why there's All Lives Matter. Right. Yeah. All Lives Matter replays the exclusion of people of African descent from civil society by imagining that they've always been excluded or included. Right. And so it's sort of perpetuating a fantasy that has been fanned. The flames have been fanned since, for hundreds of years. And so with housing, and this is the part where we can't understand neoliberalism without the welfare state. The housing policies that get kicked up in the 30s, right? The Federal Housing Association, FHA?
Authority. Yeah. I think Federal Housing Authority. Yeah. Yep.
When that's put together, they begin to zone things. You've ever heard of redlining and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
But the DNA of that was basically came out of eugenics. And so the logic of eugenics was woven through FHA policies, which redesigned and coded areas according to a eugenics, anti-Black scientific racism vision of society. And then you had $120 billion invested in these neighborhoods as the white suburbs were created. At the same time, and this unfolds from the 30s going into the 60s, at the same time that you basically have this version of socialism, you have a message from the federal government and private enterprise who's involved in this that federal intervention has nothing to do with this.
Right.
Like it's amazing how like that cognitive dissonance. So federal intervention has nothing to do with these white suburbs that are being created, or or all the other infrastructure that was designed around the suburbs,
like the highway system.
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
and defense spending and whatnot.
Yeah, sure.
Let alone corporations that have gendered racial exclusions in hiring.
Yep.
So again, now we'll go back to that's sort of that zoom out to the big picture. Then you zoom back into the 1960s again. And yeah, there's a reason why white people in the North and the West, right? And the West is for me personal because I grew up moving through Washington, Oregon, and California, and hearing these voices all my life. But you have this sense of the very real threat of social equality hitting the white suburbs. And the white suburbs, then you have this shift in ideas of race that are directly connected to housing prices, property. And then that also then connects to, wait, what about my rights as a homeowner?
Right. Yeah. That's what I'm thinking here. Like with even like the Homestead Act and like, the kind of like beginnings of this, it's always been a form of kind of like giving, that white people are going to, be in these suburban enclaves or wherever they're kind of coming together in these neighborhoods and areas of the country, and it gives them something. It gives them something to defend, and it gives them something racialized to defend, if that makes sense. Being on the West Coast, I've experienced that a lot too, and kind of seeing like how that kind of defense of the home it goes into gun culture. It goes into a lot of stuff, and it's very, very racialized. Yeah. So
and that's within the process of modernity. There's where the settler colonialism comes in.
Right.
Yep. We're still operating through a framework of settler colonial, and that's the sort of for the UNC book. The main elements are settler colonialism, which you just described, slavery, which is the anti-black component of it, right? Directly connected to housing politics, and then patriarchy, right? Which is woven through all of those elements. And so getting back to like neoliberalism, at the same time, like the moment that Goldwater's being advised by Milton Friedman and the rise of Reagan and Buckley, you have this, what'd you call it? A coming together,
coalescing. Right? Yep,
a coalescing
of a lot of different elements that were in the air.
Yeah, so you have former Democrats that just enjoyed 20 years of American socialism through housing and jobs, right, defense spending, who have been convinced that federal intervention wasn't the reason why they had this accumulation of capital.
Right,
are now listening more intently to these previously marginalized ideas connected to classical liberalism, right?
Yeah,
and then then the other sector, and that's kind of, I mean, that's not necessarily, that's sort of a no shit, right? Like it's
you're talking about how these elements of what we're calling like settler colonialism and all the kind of like different behaviors that brings out of a certain kind of class of people in America that's connected to the political system. That's like kind of the point you're making.
Yeah, it's sort of because if you can mobilize the language and mobilize and tap into that older knowledge, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of, I mean, it's like Trump. He can say certain phrases that tap into these deep sensibilities.
Yeah, right. I love that sense of older knowledge. It's almost like in the American DNA that can be like certain kinds of ideas can be activated even among people who don't really have a conscious understanding of it. They get it. They get the kind of like deeper savage thing that's being said there. I mean, we talk about like code a lot, with Republicans, but like. Trump is a master at something even beyond code, which is like calling to I love that idea of older knowledge, the kind of inborn racism and hatred and all the elements of imperialism that are like stuck inside the American imagination. It's a scary thought.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I use that word ontology, like the essence of being, the idea that you live your life through these ideas, right? And that's why it's that modernity framework. I usually label people or agents as vessels, right? And then I use Frank Wilderson. He calls sort of the moment anti-blackness kicks in, white people are deputized.
Oy.
Right, and you don't realize you're deputized. It's sort of when if you're in a group and then someone calls, like the Me Too moment, someone calls out sexism. And then you have men who automatically react in defense of the system, grappling for language and knowledge that will justify why there's pay, inequality or whatever. And to me, they're merely vessels of a systemic way of thinking or an ontology, right? It's sort of, it's that Foucault idea of power where you are a vessel of power. Right, you're channeling these older ideas.
Yeah,
and that's why it's sort of, you can see this in the way that like generational sort of differences, right? Like so, each generation has a different inset sense of how the world should work, right? The younger generation today isn't as concerned about gay marriage or like transgender, versus the baby boom who grew up in Jim Crow America, right, had very defined ideas about gender and sexuality, and they're very uncomfortable with it. So when it's brought up, they're deputized, and it's hard for them to grapple with this new sense that their children, it's easier for them to understand it, right, or their grandchildren.
Right. Yeah, I love that idea of like deputized. Is that you said that you mentioned that a name of someone where's that idea from?
Frank Wilderson. I think he writes that it's an article about civil society looking at Gramsci, but
it's such a great framework for kind of understanding how this stuff persists and how it and also how it kind of evolves generationally. It's really a great idea.
Yeah. But the other element within the 60s, so you have a convergence of what's becoming the new right. You have this convergence of these neoliberal economists. And then you have what I would just call the culture war. Like, this is the anchor of the culture war is really white America, very increasingly concerned about the actual threat of social equality with people of color and women, right?
Yeah.
And so in all my classes, I throw out this line that usually kind of makes people, like, you can see them get uncomfortable a bit, but I usually say the 1970s is the first decade in the history of the United States when white men, especially white men with property, are legislatively forced to compete with everyone else for the first time. Right.
That's such a great way of putting it. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, within the 500-year perspective, it's like, oh, duh, of course,
yeah,
right? But that's why the 70s are so significant, because, you add that to everything else going on economically, and you can see why, the nation was kind of going crazy.
Yeah, and it explains,
right.
It explains the rise of Reagan, as a kind of like white and conservative backlash to the idea that the tent is becoming bigger.
Yeah, and then the response to Obama, like I literally was writing this, right? Like, I started writing this in 2008, 2009.
Yeah.
And so it's just like literally this thing was unfolding, and it was these ghosts were screaming as I was writing this stuff.
Yeah.
But the other element that combines with this, and this is really overlooked in a lot of stuff that I've read about neoliberalism, is right. The one thing that's different about neoliberalism from the American perspective, right? The Milton Friedman, and this is where the welfare state comes in, is older classical liberalism was against monopoly capital. Right. It's that Adam Smith. He was more concerned about monopoly capital than unions.
Right. Yep.
And so for the American neoliberalism, all those projects were funded privately. Like, I think the Pioneer Fund. And there was all these those older think tanks from the 30s and 40s. And one of the things that they wanted, because they came out of these, the kind of the oligopolies of the early part of the 20th century, is that you better not go after big business, right?
Right.
And so, we go into post World War II era, and that's the moment where you have the rise and expansion of multinational corporations, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And again, their welfare state was the Marshall Plan, right? So we essentially helped multinationals get a greater foothold in the world, but they're operating within a kind of a Keynesian welfare state regulatory nation state.
Right.
And so capital moving from the United States to Europe, or capital that goes to Europe through the Marshall Plan and then is routed back to multinationals operating in Europe, they're having a difficult time bringing those dollars back.
Mm-hmm.
And so the 50s, it's fine. In the 60s, it begins to start straining. It's sort of, they've evolved to a point where the older frameworks are increasingly irrelevant. Like, they've become obstacles. So the regulatory frameworks aren't working the way they used to. You have the rise of euro dollars, and so dollars that are in Europe that can't be brought back to the U.S. Well, multinationals begin using them to again bring capital where they need it. And this again comes together in the 60s with the new right and the culture war. And by the 70s, right, you have the moment with the gold standard being dismantled. You have the early beginnings of finance being deregulated, right, in the early 70s.
Yep. Setting up the kind of insanity of Wall Street in the coming decades.
Yeah, and throughout the 70s, one of the chapters I look at Business Week. And Business Week, literally, you can see the way that the magazine itself shifts from a Keynesian liberal consensus framework into an increasingly, their set of language and knowledge is drawing off these neoliberals, the new right. By the end of the 70s, they're overtly using culture war. Like, oh, the reason why things are bad is because women are asking for too much. Feminists, civil rights movement people are asking for too much. And to me, there's I call it like American innocence in all this, right? It's sort of, we didn't mean to, engage in crimes against humanity because we're on the side of freedom, right? Like that kind of,
yep.
It's the settler family, right? The settler family is not an invasion force; it's a quaint settler family.
Yeah. We talk about that a lot on this show. They kind of like mask that imperialism and all these kind of other like really kind of dark and kind of like I don't know elements of ideologies of domination often wear a kind of a mask of progressivism or a mask of benevolence that it seems like the United States has developed and evolved over the years a mask that's very effective in like kind of putting a good spin on really horrific shit. And yeah, I think you're right. The kind of like settler ideology has a lot to do with that.
Yeah, and it's like we use Western films, right?
Yes.
Or like cop movies. Like cop movies and Western films help us to sort of digest crimes into, I guess, consumption items that make us feel good.
Sure.
Right?
Yep.
Or going back to, the Trump rhetoric. I've been using lately the word warmth. Right? Like going after historically marginalized people, bring warmth to some people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It reaffirms what they've been believing for 60 years.
Sure.
Right. And so, but anyway, during that 70s, you have this bringing together of multinationals who are looking to deregulate big government. You have white homeowners who they've never understood their place in the welfare state as homeowners. And so to them, the welfare state becomes anything that's given to minorities.
Yeah.
And so they literally begin to vote against the welfare state because they've bought into the rhetoric of both neoliberals who are trying to destroy the welfare state and the rise of multinationals, that the welfare state's no longer useful, right? Or, because neoliberalism is just a readjustment of government. It's not getting rid of big government. It's readjusting big government to the needs of capital versus that the welfare state safety net provisions. And you have that evolution, which by the 80s gets, institutionalized. But the 70s is that key moment because, right, it's sort of that shock doctrine. Right?
Yeah. Yep.
You can bring these changes in when there's a state of emergency.
Right. Yeah.
And because they're using that old language of, look, this is all about bringing freedom and individuality. And then in the wake of the civil rights movement for white people, it's, look, you didn't participate in slavery, so how come there should be affirmative action?
Right.
Or what about the civil rights? All the civil rights legislation, everyone's equal now. So
yeah. And you see that impulse becoming like, I don't know, really, really sanctified now in the Trump era, that like we're all equal and all that stuff is to be left behind, and really almost a feeling that like history doesn't matter. And we're at a moment of perfection right now, which is a really odd phenomenon to think about when you consider like how bad the situation is for most Americans. It's a really odd moment.
Yeah, and it's living through. Think about we're living through media that is everywhere versus media growing up was a magazine, newspaper. And you had to wait till 6 to watch the news. Yeah,
or for me, it was my memory is of like waking up every morning and getting the newspaper that like a kid had thrown in my parents' driveway, and like that's where I'm catching up on what's happening in the world, and it's really like an exciting moment, but it's not like a living thing really in the way it is now.
Yeah, and then that's where history is whatever is in that feed.
Yeah, right.
It's sort of like what was it, the nostalgia trap? Like,
sure,
nostalgia trap in many ways is it's not even a trap because now like what's a different word for a trap that makes it less bad?
Right.
A nostalgia realm.
Yeah.
It's nearly like it's the moment the prison becomes the world.
Right.
And there is no trap because we all choose all the things that are in the prison.
Yeah.
So how could you say it's bad?
Yeah, no, it's a weird psychology. Speaking of the 1980s, because it feels like you probably, if you were born in, you said 72, then you're kind of like coming online in terms of thinking about, I don't know, the world and stuff like that in the Reagan 80s. Is that how much did that inform kind of the direction of your thinking? Because like the Reagan era, I think of like, the things we talked about, like welfare queen, code words being developed to kind of, reinforce a lot of the ideas that are circulating around the 1970s. Reagan's kind of putting a vision together, but it also, like, I don't know, the Cold War was around. Like, how does the Cold War connect to all of that stuff too? Because it feels like the Cold War had this kind of flare up in the 80s. How do you and it's in pop culture too. I mean, I think of like Rocky and Red Dawn and all these like movies in the 80s that I often want to like show my students and kind of give them a sense of the weird pop culture landscape. But where does
they never fully appreciate Red Dawn.
Right. Red Dawn. I mean, that's such an insane. Do you show that movie too?
So good. No, I'm almost afraid to because it's so good.
Yeah.
I don't want to. It's sort of like I'll show Roadhouse.
Yeah.
But no, the Cold War is the extension of settler colonialism.
Yeah.
Right. Like Red Dawn is a settler. I mean, Red Dawn is great because you're bringing in like Mujahideen uniforms, which is ironic, right? But they're the indigenous people fighting off these foreign invaders. So it's literally it destroys the memory of like that ethnic cleansing of settler colonialism for Native Americans.
Yeah.
And it resets it into this, like, again, it's the innocent white homeowners who are being, invaded by these foreigners. It's awesome. Like it's such a.
When you say it's awesome, so you mean it's a rich text.
Yeah,
for drawing a lot of conclusions about what's going on in America, right?
Yeah, there's so much to it, and again on the meta layer too. It's. I mean, how many of the actors in that were in The Outsiders?
Right.
Like how many? So when you watch that, I mean, especially when it came out, when you watch that movie, you were watching a bunch of different things at once, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you were watching The Outsiders, you were watching, the other movies that the, various actors were in. I think it's awesome on that scale, right? It's the moment that the meta layers, like if you think of postmodernity, and I mean, on some part, I don't really believe in it because often for me, postmodernity is the moment that European intellectuals feel like the monopoly of knowledge they've enjoyed for 500 years has left them. So that means that all narratives are free.
I love
what I mean? It's kind of like, no, it's your existential crisis that's happening. It's everyone else. People of color and women are finally able to break through the monopoly of knowledge that the Enlightenment and men of European descent have had a monopoly over for centuries. But in a way, there's that weird meta layer narrative to Red Dawn, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And to a lot of those movies from there. Like think of like the Rocky. I mean, if you think of Rocky, you can't not think of Rambo.
Right.
Or the best, his shining moment, Cobra.
That's right.
Or even the more shininger moment of Tango and Cash.
Oh,
right?
God,
like it's and all those are sort of playing off. I think Tango and Cash, or is it Cobra, which is the one that has the almost like a satanic cult where they're clinking together axe handles.
I think that's Cobra.
That's Cobra.
I mean, I saw all these movies when I was really young, and they made a huge impression on me. And like that era of the kind of like, I don't know, there's something to do with. I've read a lot of kind of like theories about like, I don't know, men's bodies and masculinity and this kind of like strongman thing that happened in the 80s where you kind of like have this, I don't know, this kind of fetishization of the American male body and its ability to commit violence, really. I mean, I think of like the Schwarzenegger movies too. As a kind of like pretty rich ideologically.
Well,
almost too on the nose in a lot of ways. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's the post-Vietnam. It's a self-conscious moment, right? Like John Wayne didn't have to prove himself.
Right.
But everyone in the 80s had to start lifting weights.
Yeah, and be huge.
And like the framework I want to write, or I want to get a collection of essays together. It's just getting the time to do it, but I call it the 14-year-old theory.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So in the 80s, the 14-year-old theory was you'd have these insane movies like Rocky, Rambo, Cobra, Tango and Cash, even Roadhouse, where you have adults basically using the dialogue that a 14-year-old would use.
Right.
And be able to do things that could only happen in a comic book or cartoon. right?
Yeah. I mean, it's so over the top. It's insane. I mean, by the time you get to the 90s, I mean, these movies are like Arnold Schwarzenegger's like jumping out of fighter jets and stuff like that. I mean, it's like literally just so exaggerated that it's comical, and that's probably part of the enjoyment of those movies in some ways too.
Yeah, and then that gets transferred into politics, right?
Yep.
So, like, think of the 2000 or the what was that? The debates for who was going to be the Republican nominee.
That's right.
Like, it was just like, wow, it was just a bunch of 14-year-old boys talking about we should carpet bomb everyone. And then when you say carpet bomb, you should just say we want to ethnically cleanse the area.
Yeah. Right.
Right. Like, that's really what and that's not weird for an American to say, because we had a 300-year war against Native Americans.
Yeah. And so when you hear that kind of like the, cliche of right wing people or whatever, or American men, I hear it a lot saying like, turn the Middle East into a parking lot kind of idea, which is such a cliche, but it really, it is exactly what you're talking about. It's like literally a call for ethnic cleansing. Yeah.
And it's but done out of innocence, right? It's done for the good of the settler family.
Sure. Yeah.
Because that's the next, family values and all that kind of stuff. So it's that settler family still is like that. And then the gendered aspect of that, right? Like the idea that women don't need rights because men protect them and they don't need rights. Or
right.
Men are protecting them from a non-white savage on the frontier. And that's the dynamic or like idea of order that should prevail.
Yeah, I love that idea that you just kind of threw out there about postmodernity, because I was wondering what you were going to say about that, because you have this framework that you're calling modernity and this kind of like larger thing, and then postmodernism and the kind of like intrusion of that set of theories into academia in the the 60s and 70s is in a lot of ways like, I don't know, that's the graduate school education I got, and we very much associated it with like the left and Marxism and things like that, but we're seeing like, I don't know, when you think about like the Trump era and the alt-right and stuff like that, you're seeing a kind of like postmodernism and that idea of like nothing matters and everything's equal and anything can be interpreted in any way, and there's fake news and that kind of like chaotic attitude towards factual information and reality. That's something that the right is benefiting from right now. And I started like starting to see like how you just like kind of framed those postmodern thinkers in Europe as like, as much as they might be Marxist, they're also, I don't know, defending an old project, and they're defending their kind of racial and gendered territory. Yeah,
you've ever read any of Hal Foster?
No,
So there's a great book, you can probably find it cheap, it's Hal Foster Recodings. Art, spectacle, and cultural politics. And I did this when I was my initial MA thesis was going to compare the Situationists in France with the rise of free jazz in the United States. And so I started getting into, somehow I came across this book, and it was published in 1985. And he probably is the most influential in terms of thinking about postmodern theory. And then by the time I got through the modernity framework, I realized, or at least I envisioned postmodernism as a phase of modernity. Like modernity isn't always modernity in the sense that, modern architecture comes to an end and now you have these different like patchwork aesthetics. It's still modern. It's still modern, like colonialism and the Atlantic slave system and capitalism and ideas of the Enlightenment, the nation state, imperial, all that stuff's still going. They didn't disappear. So I've just sort of, for me, postmodernism is this. It's what Lyotard and like Baudrillard and those French, again, male French intellectuals and other men of European descent who are seeing a world. They might be sympathetic with the rise of, the post-colonial moment and the rise of feminism and the rise of civil rights. They might be sympathizing with that, but this is where that ontology equation comes in, because it's, despite them being for that, they still grew up and learned through a white supremacist patriarchal world. Right. And so for them, that dismantling of old truths, right? And you can see this in Habermas too, right? Habermas's desperate attempt to kind of look, modernity is just an incomplete project,
Right.
Well, it's not a project, it's a process.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not necessarily guided, right? Like when I teach modernity, I use a dialectic of, you have ideas which are translated into policies, which are translated into material outcomes, which then you assess, and you come up with new ideas that are translated into policies, that are translated into material outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And that allows us to see like a structure agency. It's a flexible system, right? Like the system can destroy itself because you keep misinterpreting the material outcomes.
Right.
Or you can redirect the ship by interpreting the material outcome and going, look, I know no one wants to think about this, but this is what's happening. And that allows us to kind of play with that ontology. Like, how is the interpretation of reality being affected by the last 3 centuries of history? So, So here's Hal Foster. Like Hal Foster talks about, he says that there's 2 branches of postmodernism: a neoconservative branch, right? And then there's a post-structuralist branch.
Okay, yeah, that helps. I think that makes sense.
And
yep.
Neoconservative branch, right, is this idea that we want to return to history with a big H.
Mm-hmm.
The post-structuralist branch says that history is with a little h, and there's a relativity to it.
Right.
And so, because most people feel the warmth of nostalgia and that older knowledge that they grew up with, right, sitting on their grandparents' lap and them talking about, yeah, I saw lynchings as a kid. Mm-hmm. That was no big deal. Or the baby boomers who their childhood was great in the 50s because it was a white supremacist world.
Right. Yeah.
It was Jim Crow.
Which is odd that it's still like that 50s experience of like suburban white supremacy is still the like go-to nostalgia for the culture in a lot of ways. And like even, I mean, the 1980s, I just, talked to my students at Emerson. We were thinking about Back to the Future and that movie, like, being they said it's not really an 80s movie, it's more of a 50s movie, right? It has like this kind of like most of the action takes place in this idealized imaginative space. But it's kind of incredible that we're sitting here in 2018 and I think Trump is very much called, when he's saying make America great again, I think a lot of the people that are activated by that phrase are thinking about that 1950s suburban world with Timmy riding his bike, and that kind of like, I don't know, you think of like Stranger Things almost, depicts that world in some way, that kind of like that feeling that it has something to do with childhood and it has something to do with the neighborhood, but it's the
housing.
Yeah, housing, exactly. And
things weren't complicated. Why? Because it was a white patriarchal supremacy world. Like,
yep.
There was order to it. I think that's the big thing. Like, the big difference, this is, just off the cuff, for me, the big difference between like the liberal, right, in quotes, and the conservative, in quotes, is the conservative is a lot more fearful of a collapse of existing order that they have an interpretation of that makes things okay, right?
Yeah.
That status quo.
Yep.
If there's transgender bathrooms, oh my God, it's the end of civilization.
Mm-hmm.
If there's, oh my gosh, if there is gay marriage, it'll be the end of civilization. Oh my gosh, if there is desegregation, it's going to be the end of civilization. Oh my gosh, if women vote, it's going to be the end of civilization.
If they take the guns away.
It'll be or if we get rid of slavery, how can the country operate without slave? Like, it's always kind of that reactionary, the fear of going into a world that hasn't been in practice yet. Right?
Yeah.
We've imagined equality since the Enlightenment, but because of that human nature binary, it's never been translated. Right, the ideas to policies, the policies, were not equal, mm-hmm. and it created everything leading up to the eugenics informed housing. And so there's always that idea of order. And so, and that's where that warmth comes in, right? There's a warmth about order.
Yeah, right.
That comes in. But let me read this section. It's the neoconservative postmodernism versus the post-structuralist, where he writes...
Is this Hal Foster?
This is Hal Foster.
Go ahead,
Neoconservative postmodernism advocates a return to representation. Right. So you don't take it too deeply. Like, just stay on the surface.
Yeah.
Right. So a return to representation. It takes the referential status of its images and meaning for granted. Post-structuralist postmodernism, on the other hand, rests on a critique of representation.
Mm-hmm.
It questions the truth content of visual representation, whether realist, symbolic, or abstract, and explores the regimes of meaning and order that these different codes support. Right? And there's sort of, and I think of this within history too. You have those, it's really the older generation of historians, or sort of the students that come in and, oh, tell me about World War II, but I just want to hear about tank battles.
Right, yep.
Right. There's some historians, and then just the population at large, because you can look at like what are the best-selling history books, but they want to.
I think Bill O'Reilly is the number one historian in the nation.
And rightfully so,
yeah.
right? It should be there.
If you ever go to like a Barnes and Noble, like the history section is basically like all Bill O'Reilly books now.
Killing something.
Yeah,
right?
killing something. It's all killing something. Yep. And World War II is like literally. I mean, at the Barnes and Noble that I go to, it's got the history section is literally like a small section they just call history, and then like 4 aisles that say World War II.
Yeah,
World War II is history to Americans. I mean, I think of the History Channel as like the World War II channel in a lot of ways, and I'm like, why is that such a story, and why is that such a important moment for Americans to like call back to, even when the memory of it is wrong? You know what I mean? Like a lot, you'll hear people like making the argument of like, oh, all gay marriage. I'm so glad that my World War II veteran grandfather isn't alive to see a world where men marry each other. And I'm like, World War II was a cauldron of homosexuality. Do you not understand that? World War II was a moment where like American men began to understand that they could have sex with each other, and in a larger scale than it ever happened before. And it's a signal moment in the history of gay life in America. And so, it's just a misunderstanding of history in a lot of ways, and that's just one example. But World War II has been packaged and sold to us for decades. It's maddening.
Well, I think it's the so if the U.S. since the 1600s has been at war with Native Americans, for 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. I think World War II offers a moment of redemption for the crimes of those wars.
Right. Yeah. Sure.
And it's the, I know for 300 years we did this ethnic cleansing westward expansion, but look what we did in World War II.
Yeah.
Like we fought for freedom against fascists who used to come to the United States to study our eugenics program. Right? Like.
Yep.
And so
I think Hitler literally, Hitler and other people within the Nazi leadership, they openly admired the American genocidal project towards Native Americans. They saw that as a civilizational model in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's silly. I mean, it's definitely it reminds me of when people say, well, the Democrats supported slavery.
Yeah.
And again, it's that there's your like the neoconservative postmodernism. Like to me, that's like a good example of that. The Democrats supported slavery because you're a historian. Did the Democrats support slavery? Yes.
Right.
Was there a shift in the way politics operated from the era of the antebellum America to 2018? Yes.
Well, yeah. This is the Abraham Lincoln was a Republican,
Yeah, and the Marxists were voting Republican.
Yeah, so how could the Republican Party be racist? They're the party that freed the slaves, and I'm like, that ignores more than 100 years of American political history in which those things have been totally rearranged. So I don't know a lot of people don't even know about like the Southern strategy and the Nixon thing and like how that all switched. But I guess that's part of the kind of cultural knowledge that we ignore.
Yeah, and that's again, I think going back to that, the neoconservative postmodernism, which Trump is.
Yeah.
Is so it's such a. It's impressive.
Yeah.
Right? It's so impressive.
And you're like, how brilliant is this guy? Because he doesn't seem like he's brilliant, and I don't know if he's doing this intentional. I don't know how much like intentional agency there is behind what he's doing, but he's doing something really. Really complex in a lot of ways, and simple at the same time. Like when you're talking about iconography and like that red hat, that "Make America Great Again" hat that has a kind of I don't know, a real kind of cultural power at this moment. I mean, we're talking about like just a couple days ago, Kanye West like wore one on Twitter and like blew everyone's minds just by wearing this red hat. And I thought, what a strange moment we're in that like the red hat can carry that much weight. And it made me, I was thinking about it while you're reading the Hal Foster quote, because it's kind of like, you know, what do people get from that hat? What do people understand about it? And what does it call to? And I think that, you know, there are different ways to kind of unpack that. But a lot of people just seem to know what it means. I mean, to me, like the hat is just like a sign of white supremacy. But it seems like, you know, it means a lot of things to a lot of people.
I mean, this is where the left needs to kind of rethink this. To me, and a friend of mine brought this up, but it's the new punk rock.
Yeah,
like the alt-right is the new punk rock. Like it's sort of, it's a way to rebel.
Mm-hmm.
So there is that white supremacist. It's very real, the white supremacist. But then for the generation or for people that really have no idea, right? Like that's who you're going to rebel against. It's sort of, what was that guy who was the engineer that he helped engineer Reagan's and HW? That he was from South Carolina. Lee Iacocca.
Oh,
Lee Atwater.
Lee Atwater. There you go.
You know, and again, who cares if it's real or not? But he said that, you know, he was just rebellious.
Yeah.
And so when he looked to see which party he wanted to go in, because the Democrats were in power in South Carolina, he wanted to be in the Republican Party.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so that was his way of rebelling. And then if you look at, there's a great documentary that came out, I think in 2002 on him. And it's everything that we're talking about. Like you just throw stuff out there, right?
Right.
You whisper things, you tell reporters, hey, this is off the record, but,
mm-hmm.
and then you throw something out there, and he intuitively knew it would take on a life of its own because there was such the gossipness component. Like it's such a right piece of gossip that to not write about it is to lose the story. And I think that's Trump inherently knows the gut instincts. Like it's sort of him returning to the gut, right? Like I think that's that Kelly, you know, the slowly evolving split where Kelly is increasingly not in control.
Right.
You know, Trump thinks that if he goes from the gut, he can rekindle that momentum that was 2016 when, I mean, you also have to think, dude, that momentum worked because you weren't in charge of anything yet.
Right. And it makes you wonder like how repeatable that is, because you know a lot of us didn't see it coming and thought Hillary basically had it in the bag because the Democratic Party was so like locked in, and that wasn't true, and we ended up seeing this kind of other narrative. But yeah, I wonder because I think about that rebellion thing. It's such an odd thing that like people on the alt-right, you know, talking about like free thought and rebellion as like identifying with like the president of the United States. You know what I mean? Like the idea of being a rebel is like really loving the president. Like that.
He was rich, right?
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, it's just such an insane idea.
Yeah, it's historyless.
Yeah, right.
Like it's completely. It's within a historical vacuum.
That's a fun place to be. Well, Dan McClure, I had a really great time talking to you. We should keep doing this. I feel like I can talk to you more about where things are headed because you've got a really great framework. I'm so glad that David Fauser turned me on to your work. Thanks for talking to me.
Yeah, thanks for calling up.
Oh man, wasn't that a fun conversation? I really enjoyed talking with Daniel McClure, and I hope you enjoyed listening to him. I in particular, I like the whole idea of his that theory has a place within the historical discipline, and not only does it have a place, it's kind of necessary in order to kind of make sense of it all. So, I hope to keep developing these ideas on the show, and I wanted to bring Dan back to do an AM/FM. That'd be really great. So speaking of that, there are bonus episodes up at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. If you're a subscriber, you can go download those now. If not, you can join up and download all the bonus episodes. So thanks as always for your support, and we'll see you again. Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.